Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night, everyone. Welcome to this presentation called No Touchscreen Required. I'm going to talk a bunch about voice and keyboard accessibility, where it's a little awkward that my voice isn't that great at the moment, but we'll get through it anyway. And thank you so much for Aaron for inviting me to this CocoaHeads. And super happy to share the stage with Summer and Rob later. So we have a specially themed accessibility CocoaHeads here, and that's not just because. That's because today is a very special day, especially to us in the accessibility community. And if you're here, I would hope you know about it, but today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And accessibility is something I care a lot about, and why I strive to make the products I work on accessible and share the knowledge that I have about accessibility. And that's why I accepted this invite, and why I'm always happy to learn from others and share this knowledge that I have. So that's what we're going to do today, and there's going to be a lot more in the other presentations as well. A quick introduction on myself. My name is Bas. Work on iOS, I work on accessibility and some more stuff at WeTransfer, which is a file transfer service, as you might have guessed, or maybe you even know it and have used it. Previously, I worked on the macOS accessibility team on VoiceOver at Apple. Not sure if that was on your bingo card for today, and this was great, right? In the sense that I learned a lot, and things about the inner workings of VoiceOver made a big change to macOS, and I got to know a whole great bunch of people that work on accessibility, but also beyond accessibility at Apple. I've also written a chapter for the Swift for Good Volume 1 book, which came out a few years ago now and was a project organized by no one other than Paul Hudson. It is a compilation of chapters about various topics related to Swift, and so I wrote about accessibility, and all of the copies that were sold, all of them digital, all of the revenue went to charity. And so this was a fantastic project, and I would definitely recommend you check out the book after. And so before we dive into the actual content about making an accessible app for voice and keyboard, I want to stand still at the reason why we're doing this. I bet a few of us have worked on accessibility, have tried to improve accessibility in apps, and have run into issues where other people are asking questions, and valid questions. Why should we invest in this? And I think a lot of that comes from a lack of knowledge about the topic, right? But they seem to be fair questions. And sure, it seems maybe obvious in hindsight to say it's the right thing to do, but it really is the right thing to do. It can be your neighbor, it can be your friend, it can be anyone that just will not be able to use your app or your product without investing into accessibility, right? Imagine that you can't listen to your music, or that you can't watch TV, or that you can't keep up with friends, right? And keep in touch with your family and keep in touch with your loved ones because the app is not accessible. And so I think it's always this kind of an eye-opener when you show the power of accessibility and really make sure that people can understand like what it is like to not have this opportunity to really show why we need to do this and why it's the right thing to do. And hopefully this presentation today will also give you some ideas of how you can do that. Obviously, if only it were that easy and just do the right thing and we're there. It's definitely not a straightforward process to make your app accessible, in the sense that the APIs and the code you need to write are most of the time relatively straightforward. But understanding how to make your app properly accessible and understand how users relying on assistive technologies like use your app and how their experience can be improved, that is definitely not as straightforward. but getting a lot of it, like putting in a bunch of effort and wanting to get there, that's going to be your first step for sure. So definitely do not hesitate to go and try to make your app more accessible, and don't feel like you have to be an expert or take a course or whatever. Go for it and learn and learn and learn and ask a lot of questions. And speaking about questions, definitely also make a note if you have any questions during this presentation, and I would love to talk about them and discuss them and possibly answer them as well after the presentation, or even after that on Twitter. To set this whole thing up and go from an app that is not so much accessible or hasn't taken care of any specific accessibility needs to making it accessible for voice and keyboard, let's talk about the quote-unquote evolution of accessibility on Apple platforms. And this is all the things that are available on Apple platforms, or at least a whole bunch of them, and how they work together. So very much a fundamental of accessibility on Apple platforms comes in the form of VoiceOver, which is Apple's screen reader. And then on top of that, you have Switch Control as well, which builds on top of VoiceOver in the sense that you can use a switch. So that could be a single input to navigate your screen. And for that, you use the labels and whatever we'll set up for VoiceOver, as we'll see in a minute. And then in 2019, Apple introduced voice control, which instead of the screen reading out to you what is on there, you can read out what you see on the screen and activate it. So they might feel pretty similar, and a lot of that work for VoiceOver and Switch Control will get you most of the way to voice control. But there's still a few tricks and things lying under the carpet that we'll take a look at in a while. And then the newest big accessibility technology on Apple platforms is something called full keyboard access. It's maybe a bit less of a fancy name, but so full keyboard access allows you, as the name suggests, to access your device completely by just using your keyboard. And we'll take a look at how that builds upon VoiceOver, upon voice control, and how that can allow another way of interacting with your devices for a great experience. And so these are bigger technologies when we talk about assistive technologies, but that's not everything. And this slide will definitely also not cover everything, but I do want to point out a few other things. Think about Zoom, think about dynamic type, which is definitely a big one as well that you definitely want to look into. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll focus on VoiceOver, voice control, and full keyboard access. We have reduced motion, etc., etc. And on top of that, we even have things like dark mode and backtap, Siri, and even haptics that might not even feel like assistive technologies, but can really help certain people. And especially for me, dark mode is a very big thing to cause less strain on my eyes. So definitely also take these into account when building your apps. And so kind of what I've been talking about is that there's these two separate layers of accessibility. On the one hand, you have VoiceOver, that is a screen reader, and then on the other hand, you have voice control and full keyboard access that are user input. And as I mentioned before, there's some slight differences between the two in terms of how we build for it, and we're going to take a look at that soon. And to start off this part 1 of 3, we'll start with Act 1, which is VoiceOver. And so for VoiceOver, I want to give a very brief overview of some of the API that is involved in making your app more accessible with VoiceOver. We'll definitely not be covering everything. I'm sure that Rob will tell you a bunch more. Summer will tell you a bunch more. But I want to set this up so that we can make our app accessible for VoiceOver in a minute and also full keyboard access. And this will be a good start. And definitely these parts of VoiceOver will be crucial to providing a great voice control as well as full keyboard access experience. So we have 4 variables here: accessibility label, accessibility traits, accessibility value, and accessibility hint. And if we're thinking about one accessibility element, so this is one element a user can navigate to with VoiceOver, these elements are going to have most of these variables explicitly set. And to give you an example, let's go through a slider for a music app. So here we have the accessibility label being volume. We have the traits set to adjustable, and we'll get to that in a moment. We'll have the value set to 56% in this case, and we have the accessibility hint saying swipe up or down to adjust. So this might read out to VoiceOver as something like volume 56% adjustable, swipe up or down to adjust. And I want to definitely make a note here, whilst the accessibility hints might be really nice when you start building accessible apps, and you might want to add them everywhere, and you probably should consider adding them in a bunch of places. Note that these can be turned off by the user, so you do not want to put any critical information in them that will prevent a user that has turned them off from actually interacting with your element. And then, we've all done UIKit. It's 2022. We should cover some Swift UI. Here we have some updates to the API. We have slight updates to accessibility label. Then we have the adjustable action, which is really interesting because here we are not setting a trait, but in Swift UI, you actually set an adjustable action instead of this adjustable trait, where we directly handle that action, which in UIKit you would have to do separately for custom controls especially. In the accessibility value, we set the value to 50%, so we've turned down the volume a little bit. And then we set the accessibility hint as well. And it's these kind of things like the adjustable action that make accessibility on Swift UI really cool, because the team working on Swift UI and working on accessibility in Swift UI has definitely thought about, hey, what are the things that are awkward in the API or hard to explain, and how can we improve that? And I love that they have made these kind of relatively drastic changes that are relatively opinionated, but I think really help developers understand how things are implemented, how things work, and ultimately making it easier to make an accessible app, which is obviously really, really cool. All right, so now that we've talked a bit about VoiceOver, I want to give an example of VoiceOver being used in an app. Well, not just any app, but the WeTransfer app that I'm working on. And one thing I want you to do before we start this video, pay attention to how we navigate it, what you're observing, because soon we'll show a different demo, which will greatly help to have paid attention to this first one.
Account menu button. Sent heading. Omega Speed Master button. More content available. Yes. Sent as link. 3.4 megabytes. Size. The 16th of May, 2022. Transfer date. In 6 days. Expires. Omega Speed Master. Transfer name. Omega. Double tap to dismiss pop-up window button. Close button. Select button. Sent as link 0 times. Omega Speed Master. 1 file. 3.4 megabytes. Sent 46 seconds ago. Transfer expires in 6 days. File. img underscore 9089 JPEG button. Image. More content available. File. img underscore back button. img share button. Button. Image. Jewelry. Watch.
So now that we've seen this first video and have a bit of an idea of how, adding proper labels, etc., can really help navigate the app, let's take a look at this again, but on what we would call quote-unquote normal speed, and you will see what that is in a minute, and something called screen curtain.
Account menu button. Screen curtain on. Sent heading. Omega Speed Master button. More content available. Omega Speed Master. Double tap to dismiss pop-up window button. Close button. Select button. Sent as link. Omega speed master. 1 file, 3.4 megabytes, sent 3 minutes ago. Transfer expires in 6 days, button. File, img underscore 9089 peg, button. Image, more content available. img underscore 9089 peg. Button, image, jewelry, watch.
All right, that was quite a bit. Let's go into what we're calling Act 2, voice control, and take a step back and see, hey, great, we have made some improvements for VoiceOver. How can we build on top of this to make sure that we can also have a great input experience where we can talk to our device with our voice and activate certain elements that way? And to start, as we started for VoiceOver, let's take a look at the API that we're going to be dealing with. And in UIKit, this is going to be accessibility user input labels. And I don't know of anybody watching or in the room that has not worked with accessibility user input labels, that has any idea what this might be about or how this might work. But what I first thought when I saw this and when it was introduced was, what? I don't understand how this works. Why is this API the way it is? And so to learn about it, let's take a look at its documentation. And this is a lot of text, so let's zoom in on one particular bit. Use this property when the accessibility label isn't appropriate for dictated or typed input. And so if we go back and think about the two ways of accessibility, one being the screen reader and the other being input, this is about this dictated or typed input. And you might still be wondering, okay, what is different about those? Well, let me tell you. We might have an element in our app, and not just might, we actually have this in the WeTransfer app, and it says tap to copy link. But then if we're using voice control, we're gonna have to say tap to copy link, which is really awkward and confusing. So what we want is to use this accessibility user input labels and improve this. And so making it copy link as its user input label allows us to say tap copy link. That's a lot better. Let's take a look at another example. As some of you might know, I'm a big fan of watches, and there's been an article on this website, and it's titled "It's Complicated Inside an Elongen Zone Split Seconds Chronograph." That's a lot of words. Tap "It's Complicated Inside an Elongen Zone Split Seconds Chronograph." And then maybe it might not recognize what you said, which is super awkward. Although, to be fair, most of the time it does. And one thing that is really cool is you can say part of a phrase and it will still try to match what you said with like a longer label. But we can improve this. Let's take a look at what that looks like. We can add an accessibility user input label that is called article. And so we might have some duplicates, but when we say tap article, we'll see these numbers on the screen and then we can say 1. So this is an alternate input where we could still match the whole title of this article, but there's this alternate way of accessing the element, which is a lot easier. All right, so to go back to the API and to the code, in UIKit, we would have this copy link button with a label of saying tap to copy link. And, ideally, these are all wrapped in NS localized strings and localized, and you should definitely localize these, but for the presentation, I've just made them plain strings. And so we have the accessibility user input labels that is not just copy link, but also copy. And so giving these alternatives, great, because sure, we can show names of all of these elements and users can read out, what the activation for this element is, but giving multiple options makes it a lot smoother of an experience. And as we'll see in a bit, this will also benefit full keyword access. And so for the second example, we have our accessibility label. It's complicated inside an Elongen Zone split seconds chronograph, where we set our user input labels to article and also news, as this is a good alternate for article as well as the accessibility label itself. As in the above example, tap to copy link really doesn't make sense to have as dictated input. the label of the article is still an option. And as mentioned before, with partial matching, it's still a valid way to activate that element. And so this looks, again, a little different in SwiftUI, but it's relatively similar. We set our accessibility label, we set our accessibility input labels. And note, and I've been burned by this, whereas in UIKit, we have an accessibility user input labels. In SwiftUI, it's called accessibility input label. So if your autocomplete is not working because you're trying to snug in user, that's why. And then for a second example, we have our accessibility label again and our accessibility input labels, where now we're recopying the whole label, although, you know, in the end, we'll probably still have some kind of model where we can pass this in from. But in terms of the API, it's relatively similar. So let's now take a look at a demo of voice control. Hey Siri, turn on voice control. Show names. Tap Send Transfer. Tap 1. Tap Share Link. Tap Copy Link. And so for our third and final act today, we're going to take a look at the long-awaited full keyboard access, which is, as said before, the newest addition to the family of these assistive technologies. And after all of this build-up, it must be super impressive, right? Well, yes and no, but probably in a good way. So let's go back and take a look at this comment where we say, use this property when the accessibility label isn't appropriate for dictated or typed input. And whilst we had dictated with voice control, with full keyboard access, we have typed input. So this property is going to work magically to enhance your app to allow for full keyboard access as well. And so really all we have to do is, well, not that much really. And isn't that great? Sure, we've put in a lot of work, but we've made our app accessible with VoiceOver. We've made our app then accessible with voice control. And now we have our app accessible with full keyboard access pretty much without putting in any work. And obviously this is not exactly true in real life, as navigating with a keyboard, as we will see, still requires certain containers to be set, and like you definitely are going to want to like double check and navigate through your app with your keyboard. But I've been so impressed, like going and setting up an app for voice control and voiceover and then using full keyboard access. It's just a joy because it just works. And so let me show you what that looks like. So once again, we're here in the WeTransfer app, and now we're going to navigate through it using full keyboard access, and we're going to try and upload a file. So we can use tab, and we can use tab to go through certain containers, and we can also find what we want to navigate to. And we can use the accessibility escape and do a tab B to go back. But now what we want to do is to upload a file. So let's find the upload file. And then we are going to take something from the photo and video library. Great, we have an image from our offsite. Fantastic, let's go to next. And let's get add link. And then let's transfer the file. we go. Our link is ready and we can share. We can copy the link or we can exit out. All right, so we've gone through setting up your app for VoiceOver, for voice control, for full keyboard access. These words are going to be rattling in your brain for the rest of the day, I bet. Let's look back and see what we've discussed and what we've learned. So adding VoiceOver support to your app gets you most of the way there, as in it's a great base to extend and support assistive technologies like voice control and full keyboard access. And then adding voice control support will get you pretty much all the way to also support full keyboard access on iOS. Oh, and before we end this presentation, there's one last thing, and I'm super proud of this. WeTransfer has a what we call mission accessible, and as a company, we are working very hard on really improving the accessibility across the board of all our products. And it's a big pleasure to be able to work on this kind of project and to make WeTransfer's mobile apps specifically and all the other apps as well accessible for all of our users. Thank you very much. And here's some references that I've used in the presentation, including a great WWDC talk from no one other than Summer.